Here's something I notice almost every time I walk through a retirement scenario on this channel. The moment I mention a portfolio number, a real grounded figure that could realistically support someone's life today, the conversation shifts. And it shifts in a very predictable direction. People start asking, but what about those of us who aren't retiring for another 15 or 20 years? Doesn't that number need to be way higher? Don't I need 5 million? 10 million? And I understand the impulse completely. When you're looking ahead to decades of unknowns, it feels safer to name a big number. The bigger the target, the more protected you feel. But here's the thing. When those numbers aren't grounded in anything real, they stop being a plan. They become anxiety with a dollar sign in front of them. That's what today's conversation is about. Not inflation as a concept, but inflation as something you can actually see, measure, and plan around. We're going to walk through real numbers, a realistic person's retirement, and a clear picture of what the future actually looks like when you bring inflation into the frame properly. Because once you understand what's really happening, the future starts to feel a lot less like a guessing game and a lot more like something you can genuinely prepare for. Let me introduce you to someone we'll call Margaret. Margaret is 62 years old, getting close to retirement, and she's done a solid job of building her financial life. She has $750,000 in her investment portfolio, a mix of retirement accounts and some taxable savings, and she receives the current average Social Security benefit, which sits at just over $2,000 per month. Margaret is comfortable with a 5% initial withdrawal rate from her portfolio, and she plans to stay flexible with that rate as her retirement evolves. That gives her $37,500 per year from her investments. Add in $24,000 per year from Social Security, and Margaret is working with just over $61,000 in annual retirement income. Now, that's not a number I pulled from thin air. It sits right in line with what research consistently shows as typical household spending for people in their early retirement years. Margaret isn't struggling. She's not living lavishly either. She has a home, a car, the ability to travel occasionally, and dinner out when she feels like it. She's in roughly the 75th percentile of American retirement savers. She's done the right things, and it shows. Margaret is our anchor point. She represents the kind of well-positioned, realistic retiree that much of this planning conversation should actually be centered on. Now, before we look forward, I want to take a step back, because the most powerful way to understand where inflation is taking us is to first appreciate where it has already been. Think about what $750,000 worth of purchasing power looked like at different points in history. 20 years ago, in 2005, the equivalent purchasing power of that same $750,000 was roughly $456,000. Go back another 20 years to 1985, and that same lifestyle, same cars, same modest vacations, cost about $252,000. Push further back to 1965, and you're looking at approximately $73,000. Sit with that for a moment. The life Margaret is living today, the one that costs $750,000 to fund, would have cost $73,000 60 years ago. Nothing fundamental about her lifestyle changed. She still needed a roof over her head, food on the table, transportation, and some enjoyment. The only thing that changed was the number on the price tag. And this is where our brains play tricks on us. When we hear $750,000 retirement portfolio, it registers as serious, substantial, real. When we hear 73,000, something in us dismisses it. That feels like not enough. But for someone retiring in 1965, $73,000 was exactly what $750,000 is today. It funded real retirements, real lives, real security. So when someone looks ahead 20 years and says, you'll need 5 million to retire, what they're really wrestling with, whether they know it or not, is the mechanics of inflation. They're trying to account for the fact that the price of the same life keeps rising. The problem isn't the insight, it's that the number gets thrown out without any real grounding. Let's ground it. When we look at how prices have shifted across rolling 20-year windows, a pattern starts to take shape. Between 1965 and 1985, prices rose by roughly 3.4 times, a period marked by some of the most severe inflation the modern U.S. economy has experienced. From 1985 to 2005, that same 20-year window saw prices rise by about 1.8 times, considerably more moderate. From 2005 through 2025, prices increased approximately 1.6 times. Rather than anchoring to the most dramatic period or the calmest one, a reasonable long-term planning assumption settles somewhere in the middle, prices roughly doubling every 20 years or growing by approximately 2.2 times over that span. With that as our working framework, Margaret's $750,000 portfolio today would need to be closer to $1.65 million in 20 years just to support the same lifestyle. Not a more expensive lifestyle, not more travel or a bigger home, the exact same life, just priced in the dollars of that era. Now let's talk about Social Security, because it plays a very specific and important role in this picture. Each year, Social Security benefits receive what's called a cost of living adjustment, COLA. The purpose of that adjustment is to help benefits keep pace with inflation so that retirees don't lose ground in terms of purchasing power over time. When you smooth out the unusual spikes and look at what these adjustments have averaged across a long historical window, you land at roughly 2.2% per year, which, not coincidentally, aligns quite closely with our long-run inflation estimate. So if Margaret's Social Security benefit is $2,000 per month today, and that benefit grows at approximately 2.2% annually for the next 20 years, her monthly check would grow to around $3,100 per month. At first, that looks like a meaningful increase, and in nominal terms, it is. But in purchasing power terms, $3,100 in 20 years is essentially what $2,000 buys today. The number is bigger, the lifestyle it supports is the same. Now let's build out Margaret's retirement picture 20 years from now, step by step. First, the portfolio. To maintain equivalent purchasing power, Margaret, or someone in her position starting retirement 20 years from now, would need approximately $1.65 million. Using that same 5% initial withdrawal rate, that generates $82,500 per year from investments. Second, Social Security. At $3,100 per month, that's $37,200 per year. Combined, that gives a total annual income of just under $120,000, which is approximately double Margaret's $61,000 today. Not because the future version of Margaret is living better, simply because everything costs more. Now let's build out Margaret's retirement picture 20 years from now, step by step. First, the portfolio. To maintain equivalent purchasing power, Margaret, or someone in her position starting retirement 20 years from now, would need approximately $1.65 million. Using that same 5% initial withdrawal rate, that generates $82,500 per year from investments. Second, Social Security. At $3,100 per month, that's $37,200 per year. Combined, that gives a total annual income of just under $120,000, which is approximately double Margaret's $61,000 today. Not because the future version of Margaret is living better, simply because everything costs more. Here's what I want you to notice, though. The relationship between the two income sources shifts over time. Today, Margaret's portfolio provides about 61% of her income, with Social Security covering the remaining 39%. In the future version of that same retirement, the portfolio contributes roughly 69% of income, and Social Security accounts for about 31%. Why does the portfolio carry more weight over time? Because portfolios, when invested and growing, respond to inflation not just through adjustments, but through compounding growth from a larger base. Social Security does its job of maintaining a floor, and it does that job reasonably well, but the portfolio, because it starts from a higher dollar amount, moves in larger absolute swings as it adjusts upward. The percentage of inflation may be the same, but the dollar impact is amplified. Social Security protects the foundation. Your portfolio does the heavier lifting when it comes to sustaining a full retirement income. There's an important nuance to the inflation conversation that often gets glossed over. Inflation doesn't hit every retiree the same. The headline inflation figure, the one you hear discussed in the news, reflects a broad basket of goods and services for the average American household. But your actual experienced inflation depends entirely on how and where you spend your money. Consider housing. If you enter retirement with your home fully paid off, you're largely insulated from rising rents and home prices. That's a significant portion of the average budget that simply isn't working against you the same way it would be for someone renting. When your Social Security COLA arrives each year, more of that adjustment can actually go toward other spending because your biggest fixed expense isn't growing. Healthcare tells a different story. Medical costs have historically risen faster than general inflation, and that trend tends to intensify as we move deeper into retirement. Prescription costs, specialist visits, Medicare premiums, these have a way of growing at a clip that outpaces the headline number and can erode the value of COLA adjustments over time. The honest framing here is this. Your personal inflation rate is shaped by your specific life, what you own, what you owe, how you spend, where you live, and what stage of health you're in. That headline number is a starting point for conversation, not a final answer for your plan. And this is precisely why blanket statements, "you'll need 5 million" or "inflation will destroy your savings," deserve to be met with calm skepticism rather than panic. Those statements may apply to someone, they likely don't apply to everyone, and they certainly don't apply by default to you. So, what does this actually mean for how you plan? The first and most important step is to define the life you want to fund, not a generic retirement, your retirement. What does it cost today, in today's dollars? What matters most to you? Travel, family proximity, a paid-off home, flexibility for healthcare needs? When you build your target around a real picture of your life, your number becomes something meaningful rather than something arbitrary. From there, apply a realistic inflation assumption, a long-run estimate of somewhere between 2% and 2.5% annually is reasonable for planning purposes, though your personal situation may call for adjustments, particularly if significant healthcare spending is expected. Run that projection forward over your specific time horizon. If you're 45 today and targeting retirement at 65, you have 20 years. If you're 55 and looking at 10 years, the inflation impact is considerably more modest. The math changes significantly depending on where you are on that timeline. Then, and this is the piece that makes all of this actionable, revisit and recalibrate regularly. An inflation-adjusted retirement plan isn't something you build once and file away. It's something you review as your income grows, as market conditions evolve, and as your sense of what retirement looks like sharpens over time. Which brings us to a point that deserves its own moment of attention. Inflation pushes future numbers higher. That's real. But income has a way of growing over time, too. The median household income for a 40-year-old in the U.S. today sits at roughly $86,000 per year. 40 years ago, that same household might have earned $15,000 to $20,000. The numbers were smaller, and so was the capacity to save. But people built retirement security anyway because their saving scaled with their earning. I think about this when I consider my own family. Looking back at older tax documents, seeing what a solidly middle-class household earned decades ago, the numbers feel almost unrecognizable by today's standards. But those were real, full lives funded by real dollars that carried real weight in their time. The future will be the same. Someone retiring in 2045 will look at their $1 million-plus portfolio and understand it the way we understand $750,000 today, as a reasonable, grounded foundation for a comfortable retirement. Here's what I want to leave you with. Inflation is not a threat that makes retirement impossible. It is a reality that makes intentional planning non-negotiable. The difference between those two framings is enormous, and it changes the way you approach the next 10, 20, or 30 years. $1 million today doesn't carry the purchasing power it did in 1985. That's true. And $1 million today can still fund a very comfortable, meaningful, well-lived retirement for the right person with the right plan. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Looking forward, the numbers will be larger. That is guaranteed. But your income will grow too. Your savings capacity will grow too. And if you build a plan that accounts for inflation as a known variable rather than treating it as an unknowable threat, those larger numbers become entirely reachable. The goal of retirement planning has never been to watch digits accumulate on a screen. It's to maintain real purchasing power, the ability to live the life you want in the world as it actually is at the time you're living it. Inflation moves the target. Good planning moves with it. If you're somewhere in that 10 to 30-year window before retirement, I'd encourage you to take one quiet hour this week and sketch out what your retirement actually looks like. Not in future dollars, in today's dollars. What does it cost? What income sources will you have? What gaps exist between those two numbers? That clarity, more than any specific dollar target, is where your real retirement preparation begins. If this conversation brought something into focus for you, I'd love to hear what came up. Leave your thoughts below, especially if you're actively working through inflation projections for your own timeline. And if you found this useful, passing it along to someone who's navigating these questions could be one of the more genuinely helpful things you do for them this week. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.